Hitler's decision to form a great offensive against the tempting, thinly held front of the Ardennes, the scene of his 1940 victory, had one unexpected result. It delayed a planned Allied offensive and thus permitted the Russians to launch their attacks to the Oder River against greatly weakened opposition and advance further into Germany. Had Hitler sent his mobile reserve to the east rather than to the Ardennes, it is entirely possible that the Western Allies and Russians would have met somewhere in Poland. The Bitter Woods, page 469. Had Germany surrendered after the Bulge, then half of Poland would have been spared being overrun by the Soviet Red Army. But Hitler had his heart set on Operation Nordwind, North Wind, and Ike strung the British along until April by giving them American troops and appearing to cooperate with the British plans. But when the time came to openly break with the British, Ike did not hesitate. Hitler's hope that he could repeat the exploits of Frederick the Great of Prussia in dividing the alliance facing him proved to contain a germ of substance, but in the end that hope was defeated. Just as Hitler erred in assuming that the Supreme Commander would be required to consult Washington before radically altering his strategic plans, just as he erred in underestimating the competence of the Allied command and the fighting qualities of the American soldier, he erred in thinking that one powerful attack could split what he regarded as a weak coalition. The Bitter Woods, page 392. The German Navy had basically pulled out of the war in 1944 after the Admiral Canaris business in the 20th of July plot, and the Kriegsmarine had been full of Swedes and was heavy with Viking blood, while the army was driven by Bavarians and various mountain folk, and after the Hesse betrayal, the Luftwaffe had been largely discredited and shunted aside. Speer and Hitler had been putting their money on the V-1 and V-2 rockets, along with other wonder weapons such as huge railway guns that took resources away from the more mundane necessities such as food and clothing and gasoline and medical supplies. And the result was that the Luftwaffe had been unable to stop the carpet bombing from the air. At Stalingrad, the German soldiers had gone into the city to get out of the wind, and the battle fought block by block, building by building, may have worn them down month by month, but it kept them from freezing right away out on the prairie. Mostly Hitler had buckled down to his political intrigues with the British, indulging in their fantastical historical recreations, and Hitler was exceptionally gullible to this manipulation due to his fascination with the writings of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, who wrote poetry about eternal recurrence and the power of destiny, ideas that swung right along with the drugs Hitler had been taking. And all that fancy talk and those empty promises kept Hitler focused on trying to ruin Mother Russia for his British conspirators, rather than doing what was best for the fatherland. Chief Müller. Many of these officers were involved in the conspiracy, and many wanted to join with the Russians against the West. Stauffenberg himself was very pro-Russian. I personally was of the belief that General Berger had connections with the communists, but I could not prove it, and Himmler would hear nothing bad about Berger and became so angry that I was temporarily forced to abandon my pursuit of him. Q. Stauffenberg was the man who planted the bomb, wasn't he? Chief Müller. Yes, he was the actual ringleader, and he was in touch with the Soviets. There was liaison, you know, between this group, which was certainly an agency of the Russian intelligence, and the dissident groups in the upper levels of the army. These gentlemen were more interested in a man's ancestors than his political convictions. Don't misunderstand me. There are very many brave and loyal officers, most of them in fact, but many of the very top generals, mostly aristocrats and junkers, who were either infected with pro-Russian sentiments or were sabotagers of Hitler for reasons of class pride, got their fingers into the plot at one level or another. We followed up all the information we had, and the Soviet thread came up almost at once. Gestapo Chief, page 145 through 54. You can train a Russian soldier not to betray the division or regiment, but you cannot prevent him from talking about such natural and self-evident things as, for example, that Alaska must be taken from the Americans because they made the Tsar drunk before getting him to sign it away, or that after the defeat of Japan, Russia was to get the whole of Manchuria, that after the defeat of the fascists, i.e. the Germans, it would be necessary to destroy the capitalists in Europe, i.e. the English, and to take Switzerland as they went along because it was harboring all the Nazi leaders. These things are so self-evident that they must be obvious to everyone. They lay in the natural course of justice, so what could be the harm in talking about them? Comes the Comrade, by Alexandra Orme, New York, William Morrow and Company, Incorporated, 1949-1950, page 133. Lenin had welcomed the Americans in Kamchatka because he believed their presence would protect him in the East from both the Japanese and the British, and American oil companies had been given the rights to oil on the Kamchatka Peninsula and to the Sakhalin oil fields by the early Soviets, which Japan wished to have for itself. At the end of Hitler's war, Ike wanted to split Korea in half with Russia, just as he had divided Germany, and the dividing line was the 38th parallel that had been decided back in 1943 at the Tehran Conference, and it had been agreed that Stalin would administer the northern half, while the Americans held the south, but first they had to get rid of the Japanese. The May 4th movement was an anti-imperialist and anti-feudal revolutionary movement which began on May 4, 1919. In the first half of that year, the victors of World War I, i.e. England, France, and the United States, Japan, Italy, and other imperialist countries, met in Paris to divide the spoils and decided that Japan should take over all the privileges previously enjoyed by Germany in Shantung Province, China. On Practice, 4 essays on philosophy by Mao Tse-tung, Peking, Foreign Languages Press, 1966-1968, page 22. Vladivostok was right above the border of North Korea, and Vladivostok was Russia's only port on the Pacific Ocean. And when Stalin heard about the secret British presence in North Korea at the end of Hitler's war, he quickly moved the Red Army to Vladivostok because he needed to keep North Korea from becoming a threat to Russia. And thanks to Kim Philby, Stalin was well aware of the duplicity being undertaken by the British after their ignominious failures and humiliating losses at the end of Hitler's war. Stalin had not declared war on Japan until the 9th of August in 1945, because he could not have beaten the Germans if he also had to fight the Japanese. In the summer of 1945, new Japanese torpedo rocket fighters were being built using coolie labor deep within tunnel complexes in Japan, and the tunnels were deep enough to survive nuclear bombs. The Japanese jet airplanes were more advanced than the new German jets, and they had hundreds of these airplane factories, and when democracy was finally forced on Japan, there were over 10,000 jet airplanes ready to go just as soon as the fuel was delivered to get them into the air, but there had been no fuel to power the new Japanese jet fighters yet. Stalin had made the deal with FDR about the 38th parallel, but not with Churchill, who might still have some cards up his sleeve, and Stalin had been assured that the British were kept out of the loop when Truman dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and Stalin believed the Americans were no longer working with Britain because the British had their hearts set on a land invasion of Japan, and they had maps and manifests on the drawing board when the first live atomic bomb test proved to be successful. 17 July 1945. Started with usual work in the office, then COS Chief of Staff, at which we discussed new papers received by the Secretariat from the Americans. The first was the American reply to our desire to participate in the direct attack on Japan. The reply was far better than we had hoped for, and the offer is accepted in principle. The second was a question of command in the Pacific. There I foresee more trouble ahead. We want a greater share in the control of the strategy in the Pacific, and they are apparently reluctant to provide this share. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 706. It is interesting to note Winston's reaction and my counter-reactions to the atomic bomb news. Winston's appreciation of its value in the future international balance of power was certainly far more accurate than mine. But what was worrying me was that, with his usual enthusiasm for anything new, he was letting himself be carried away by the very first and rather scanty reports of the first atomic explosion. He was already seeing himself capable of eliminating all the Russian centers of industry and population without taking into account any of the connected problems, such as delivery of the bomb, production of bombs, possibility of Russia also possessing such bombs, etc., etc. He had at once painted a wonderful picture of himself as the sole possessor of these bombs and capable of dumping them where he wished, thus all-powerful and capable of dictating to Stalin! War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 710. 24 July, 1945. Thus finished our combined Chiefs of Staff meeting in Berlin! Where we had never hoped to meet in our wildest dreams in the early stages of this war, and now that we are here I feel too weary and cooked to even get a kick out of it. It all feels flat and empty. I am feeling very, very tired and worn out. It had been much the easiest of any of our meetings. The old battles were done and finished. No more battles to stop Americans from crossing the Channel too early. No more battles to lead them to North Africa and keep them there. No more battles to bring them along through Sicily to Italy, and no more battles to hold them in Italy till the critical moment. All that was now past history. There now only remained the Pacific problems to coordinate, and as in this theater they had always been much more of a predominant partner, it was more a matter of conforming to their strategy. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 711. 2 August 1945. Finally long discussion with Simpson on plans for our imperial expedition for the invasion of Japan, with a corps of 1 British, 1 Canadian, and 1 Australian division. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 714 and 15. 9 August 1945. Quite a long COS, Chief of Staff, with the planners in discussing final actions necessary to put into action the preparation of the corps for the invasion of Japan, Ibid. Even when the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August, Japan would not surrender until the 15th of August, and the day before Japan surrendered, the Soviets landed in North Korea to do their part against the Japanese, and Stalin quickly cleared Japan out of the north and stopped at the 38th parallel in Korea the day after the Japanese surrender had been agreed. The Japanese were still in control of South Korea, where the Americans were supposed to do their part, and the Red Army had done the usual raping and pillaging, but the Koreans insisted that the behavior of the Russians was not nearly as bad as the Japanese and the Germans. It would not be until the 8th of September that Truman sent General John Reed Hodge to South Korea to administer his half, and Hodge came in with the Incheon landing while several thousand Japanese governors were still in South Korea, and Hodge had fought in the Pacific Theater and had been involved in the invasion of Okinawa and had come to respect the Japanese, and to his credit, it was hard for Americans to tell the difference between the Koreans and the Japanese at first, but that would quickly change. Hodge had started appointing Japanese leaders because he noticed that the Koreans were more favorable to communism, while the Japanese were decidedly not. And when the Russians heard this, they came to Busan to save Korea from the Japanese and from the Americans, who were too stupid to know the difference between Japanese and Koreans. And Stalin had no choice but to confront the Americans because his friend FDR was dead. The Koreans had learned about communism from the Chinese, who'd been helping them fight the Japanese during Hitler's war, and the Japanese in Korea had not heard about the Japanese surrender, or they simply disbelieved it. And the Soviet invasion of North Korea helped to convince the Japanese that the war had indeed been lost, and so the Russians went a long way towards ending Hitler's war for the Koreans. Kim Il-sung was chosen by Stalin to be the chairman of the party in North Korea in December of 1945, and he was elected in August of 1948, while the South held their own elections that were won by Syngman Rhee. And Kim Il-sung had fought with the British in the Burma theater, and the Japanese had nicknamed him Tiger. The Japanese had kidnapped his girlfriend and murdered her, and most of Kim Il-sung's men had been killed by the Japanese by the end of 1940, and Kim Il-sung escaped into Russia, where he was trained and promoted to a major in the Red Army during Hitler's war. The Americans went to Moscow to talk with Stalin in December of 1945 to reaffirm the agreement of the 38th parallel, but the UN decided in 1948 that South Korea should be the sole government of Korea because the British were resisting Ike's agreement with Stalin at Tehran and at Potsdam. And on the 25th of June in 1950, the North tried to stop the South from taking over, and the Korean War was on. President Syngman Rhee of South Korea had been educated in America and was the one who had convinced FDR that Korea should be independent from Japan. And after the 1948 election, tens of thousands of communists and Japanese collaborators were murdered under President Rhee's watch. And while the UN thought the Korean War was about stopping Russian aggression, the Korean War was actually a fight against China. The British had a Korean general named Lee Byung-seok, who they were using as a puppet. And when the Chinese found out that the British were involved in South Korea, China quickly moved because the Chinese hated the British even more than they hated the Japanese. China did not intervene until late 1950, and did so because President Rhee was killing communists because that's how things got done in Korea. And it was hard for the Chinese to tell the difference between the British and the Americans at first, and things went badly. But when the Americans built a military base in Korea, they cut Britain out of any military contracts, which went a long way towards teaching the Koreans the difference between these two brothers, cursed with a common language. China had heard that the British also had a secret presence in the North, and China became more determined to help the North gain sovereignty free from the UN. And the Russians were grateful for Chinese help to protect Vladivostok. Russia stayed back from the fighting to avoid trouble with America because over 90% of the soldiers fighting for the UN in the Korean War would be Americans. The Japanese and the British had landed together at Vladivostok in the Great War in 1918, while the Czechs were marching towards Vladivostok. And the Czechs had taken over the Trans-Siberian Railway in June of 1918 and met up with the Whites, then went to the Volga and seized Ekaterinburg and moved back towards eastern Russia. But the Reds fought back and forced them into Siberia, and the Reds tried to take back Vladivostok but were stopped by 75,000 Japanese soldiers and the other troops sent there by France, Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. With that experience under his belt, Stalin had been helping to promote communism in China because he thought it would go a long way towards helping them to keep out the British. And the Whites would leave Vladivostok by early 1919, but the Japanese stayed for over 4 years, and Russia would not get Vladivostok back until October of 1922. It took the Americans 2 months in the Korean War to get to the Chinese border, and MacArthur was told to pull back to the 38th parallel rather than go to war with China. And the British had gained their secret presence in North Korea by telling them that the Russians were their enemy. and the British promised the North Koreans that America would not intervene. But the primary problem had been that it was hard for the Koreans to tell the difference between the Americans and the British in the beginning. MacArthur was firmly anti-British, and in 1951, rumors went out that he wanted to use atomic bombs against the Chinese, and from this rumor there would be hell to pay for MacArthur, whether or not it was true. And when the Crown refused to return Hong Kong to the Chinese, the British would threaten to drop one on the Americans. China had been given Taiwan after the Japanese were forced out at the end of Hitler's war, and Taiwan had been called Formosa by the Dutch traders who had arrived in 1623 when Taiwan still had a native population. And the Dutch East India Company built Fort Zeelandia and soon began to rule the natives. China took control of Taiwan in the 1660s and sent in settlers from China. And by the 1890s there were over 2 million Han Chinese and 200,000 indigenous people in Taiwan. After the Japanese victory in 1895 in the First Sino-Japanese War, a peace treaty ceded the island of Taiwan to Japan, and Taiwan became Japan's first colony. By 1905, Taiwan began producing enough rice and sugar to sustain itself with a small surplus, and Japan had been the first non-European country to succeed with a modern colony. But the Japanese went overboard by imposing the Japanese culture and language on the natives, and they built a police state along with the schools and hospitals, and at the very least their efforts were overzealous. The Japanese had not attacked Russia at the beginning of Hitler's war, but had moved into the Dutch East Indies to use them as an oil supply because the Americans had cut them off. And the British told America not to worry about the Japanese because the British could monitor them with the magic purple code-breaking machine. The British had been telling the Americans that Japan was going to attack Russia, and Churchill had spoken of it as often as he talked about Hitler. But FDR knew better than to take Churchill's drunken rambling and whining harangues too seriously, so he had failed to pass that information on to Stalin, and FDR had embargoed oil to Japan to prevent them from attacking Russia in the first place. When the Japanese refused to leave Korea after Hitler's war, the Americans went over to convince them to go back home, and Ike was elected in 1952 and quickly put an end to the Korean War. Ike served 2 terms with Nixon as his vice president, and JFK was elected in 1960 after Ike. And when JFK was murdered, he was replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who would expand the Vietnam War. And Nixon would be elected to be the President of the United States 8 years after JFK's election. Both Nixon and JFK had tried to bring some sanity to America by cutting back on the CIA's endless wars, and Nixon would be forced out of office in an FBI sting operation as soon as he brought peace with honor to Vietnam. Ike had won the Electoral College vote in 1952, 442 to 89, and he won a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate, with Nixon as the tiebreaker in the Senate. And Ike and Nixon did even better in 1956, winning 457 to 73 electorally. And Ike proposed and pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 that Democrats would later take credit for. It had been Ike who sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock to escort the little black kids into the white schools, and Martin Luther King had written Ike a thank you note for that. Ike had seen the skill and competence of the black soldiers under his command during Hitler's war, and along with FDR, had pushed for equality as a matter of national security. These policies of Ike and FDR were expanded in the peacetime economic boom after the war, and the economy was fueled by the Republicans until the Democrats took over in 1960, and along with their stifling economic measures, the Democrats brought a tsunami of drugs from Southeast Asia and from India so they could implement the socialism of the not-so-great society. After Hitler's war, the biggest digging machine ever built had started strip mining coal in Ohio, and it was called the Big Muskie, and was 22 stories high and longer than 1.5 football fields, and it used as much electricity as a city of 100,000 people. The oil companies were fighting over the production of nuclear energy, while the Rosenbergs were sentenced by a jury of 11 men and 1 woman. And none of what they'd given the Russians had been scientifically important. People were abnormally afraid of Russia because they'd been looking at a non-Mercator map in their textbooks, a projection that made the country look abnormally large. But the truth was that the Great Cold War was kept from going hot by dozens of spies sharing secrets with the other side, ensuring that each knew the other's formidable capabilities, and both Russia and America were completely aware of what the other was doing, thanks to these many spies and double agents. Russian spies told the CIA the truth about the Koreans and swore it wasn't Soviet expansion, that Stalin was only interested in socialism in one single country, which was actually national communism. And when Trotsky and his international communists were expelled from Russia in January of 1929, Trotsky had first taken refuge in Constantinople, then tried Norway, and had ultimately gone to Mexico. In the first days of the war with the whites, Lenin had directed his trusted Trotsky to go to Mexico to scope out the extent of British hegemony over Mexican oil. And when Trotsky showed up back in Mexico in 1940, the British had him killed, then cooked up the story that Stalin was behind Trotsky's murder to discredit the Russians, and Trotsky's reports about British plans for the exploitation of Mexico were destroyed. Lenin had met Trotsky in London in 1902 when Lenin had been learning to speak English, and Trotsky had preferred America over England because he spoke German and was able to get around in America with it. The communists had not troubled to make it easy for the British. At a Congress of the Peoples of the East held in Baku in September of 1920, Zinoviev had said that the Comintern, quote, turns today to the peoples of the East and says to them, brothers, we summon you to a holy war, first of all against British imperialism. At this there were cries of jihad, jihad, and much brandishing of picturesque Oriental weapons. However, Moscow followed up this colorful beginning in Asian foreign relations not with an Eastern crusade, but instead in February 1921 with treaties with Afghanistan and Persia, where British interests were considerable. 20th Century Russia, page 233. The year after Trotsky was murdered, the U.S. had to settle a dispute between the Mexican government and private oil companies in the fall of 1941. And the U.S. made a cash offer that was not acceptable to the British because it excluded managerial control over workers striking for higher wages. And the following month, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It would not be until October of 1943 that the oil companies would accept the cash offer, and it would take until 1947 for the British-owned Mexican Eagle to settle for cash reimbursements for their seized oil companies' equipment and property in Mexico. After which the Mexicans set up a national oil company, but were never able to make enough profits to expand or to pay its workers a decent wage. Had the Russians and the Americans been allowed to do business in 1945 after Hitler's war, there would have been no place under the sun for the old way of doing business with the British. And their skullduggery had started up first thing in the new United Nations that had begun with such bright promise in San Francisco. 3 days later, the trap snapped shut. Rising from the snow-drifted valley of the Yalu, surging outward across a desolate sub-zero mountainscape, a massive Chinese onslaught roared down the Korean peninsula for 120 miles, sweeping before it MacArthur's stunned, misaligned armies. When its fury was spent, all North Korea had been reclaimed under the red flag, and MacArthur was again dug in deep in the south. This time, he was confronted not by a thin Korean line that could be turned and enveloped, but by infinite layers of Chinese who measured their wars in decades. Confessions of a Muckraker by Jack Anderson with James Boyd, New York Balanchine Books, Random House, 1979, page 181. In Montana, a draft board refused to call up any more inductees until the use of the A-bomb against China was placed at MacArthur's discretion. At this juncture, MacArthur cabled to the Joint Chiefs a secret win the war plan. He asked for unrestricted airstrikes against China to destroy its military installations, industrial sites, and transportation facilities, a blockade of China's coast, naval shelling of its coastal cities, a second front on the Chinese mainland to be opened by Chiang's (Kai-shek now in hiding from Mao), Chinese national troops transported by our Navy and supported by our Air Force. The overthrow of communism in China was thus to be added to the unification of Korea as a war goal. If, for political reasons beyond his ken, these measures could not be taken, he offered an alternative that would at least salvage Korea. He proposed that the Chinese forces in Korea be sealed off from Manchuria, their source of supply and reinforcement, by laying a radioactive belt composed of nuclear wastes across the top of North Korea. When the cordoned-off Chinese armies ran out of supplies, he would destroy them via new Inchons in the Grand MacArthur style. Confessions of a Muckraker, page 184. With the beginning of the Korean War, the intensity of the anti-American propaganda was greatly increased. We understood that the authorities were trying to whip up violent emotion among the Chinese people. In the hysteria, our American missionary teachers were accused of being spies. The evidence against them was too flimsy for belief by a rational person, but the teachers were hounded out of the country. The rest of us rationalized this injustice with the idea that the communists were inexperienced and were trying to achieve quickly a great deal, so that they were bound to make a few mistakes. Escape from Red China by Robert Lowe, as told to Humphrey Evans, New York, Coward McCann, 1962, page 57. The masses neither understand nor care about the ideological disputations. The peasants, and that is nearly the whole of the population, want an old-style family farm. The workers want more wages and more food. The intellectuals, except the minority embroiled in the struggle, want only to be left alone to think and study and work without whips at their backs. Workers' Paradise Lost, 50 Years of Communism, a Balance Sheet, by Eugene Lyons, New York Paperback Library, 1967, page 315. Chiang Kai-shek government had sent Chinese students to study in England, but more had been sent to America because they had more schools, and Bob Lowe had gone to the University of Wisconsin after Hitler's war. We were amazed that the country was so sparsely settled. The mountains were dramatic, but the plains were monotonous and the infrequent villages identically drab. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, the train stopped for 2 hours. After a short walk from the station, we entered a restaurant. At least we thought it was a restaurant. Now I know it was a bar and grill. The place was dark and smelled of disinfectant and stale beer. We found a table and ordered hamburgers and tea from a huge woman with a booming voice. When she left, we had a chance to look around the place. With growing horror, we saw that it was only too familiar. Every cowboy film had shown the same bar and the same stag's head. The loungers at the bar spoke with the same drawl and wore wore much the same costumes. We all had the same idea at the same time. Always in the films showing this sort of place, a fight started and shooting went on until the air was blue with gun smoke. Our table was placed so we might well be caught in the withering crossfire. My companions wanted to leave immediately. I had the same impulse, but I resisted such an undignified retreat. Thus we waited tensely. I was clutching the pad of traveller's checks in my pocket until we were served. We took one bite of the food, paid the check, and then left. Escape from Red China, page 27. I boarded with a couple named Agnes, who, I was astonished to learn, were in their 70s. People of this age in China were apt to be so infirm as to need constant attention. Mr. Agnes, however, although retired on a pension after 50 years with a railroad company, participated energetically in civic affairs. Mrs. Agnes, besides running a house, keeping a boarder, and entertaining friends, did expert dressmaking. Neither of them did what they did because they needed money, but because they enjoyed it. I was much impressed. Escape from Red China, page 28. As soon as Bob Lowe arrived in Wisconsin, he met another Chinese named Charlie Chan, who took him night clubbing. And everywhere we went, Charlie was always perfectly at home. If the place was small, his ploy was to stop some man on the street. "Friend," he would say, "my name is Chan. Everyone calls me Charlie. You have a great little town here. Where can a guy get himself a drink and a girl?" Escape from Red China, page 32. In the months that followed, Charlie took me on quote-unquote binges all over the United States. Almost every weekend we took a trip to some new place, and during longer holidays we went to the more distant corners of the country. Escape from Red China, Ibid. Chiang Kai-shek could no longer afford to pay his tuition, and Bob Lowe was sent a one-way ticket back to China, where some of his school friends started a club called the Society for the Spread of Science, but all they talked about was communist politics. "They only want power," he said bitterly. "The rest of us are tired of fighting and wrongdoing. We want peace and decency. The communists use these desires against us. They will make our country into hell." His words in Chinese were quaintly old-fashioned, and when used to describe something as modern as communists, they sounded almost ludicrous. Escape from Red China, page 40 and 41. Called Returning Students in China by Mao's new communist government, they were treated like royalty by, quote, soldiers in sand-colored uniforms, close quote, who greeted them while, quote, handling their rifles with ease, close quote. My immediate impression was that they were absurdly young. They looked like simple, open-faced teenage farm boys. Escape from Red China, page 42. I had spent 10 years of my life in the schools and colleges of the university, and now I was coming back as an important teacher. I was given quarters with 3 other bachelor professors in a fine house on campus. Escape from Red China, page 47. Bob Lowe met the yes-men, the eyes of the party, and the yes-men sat in Bob's discussion groups and recorded what everyone said. They all wear the same uniform, a drab 2-piece kind of coverall in either blue or khaki. They are invariably young, thin, and intense. They look sexless and fanatic. They all carry pens and diaries in which they note down everything they see and hear. Escape from Red China, page 43. One day, Bob and his friends went off on their own without telling the authorities, and they were arrested and detained at a police station. He looked up at me for the first time. I saw that his face was dark with fury. I realized that he was not merely uneducated, he was stupid as well, and I felt a tremor of fear. After I had made my explanation, he again demanded to know why we had come to Peking. I began all over, this time using simpler words. Escape from Red China, page 45. In early 1950, we began to hear rumors that the communists were using excessive brutality in implementing land reform. In mid-1950, when these rumors were persistent, I was included in a group of 10 professors invited to witness a quote-unquote struggle meeting against a landlord in a village 3 hours' drive from Shanghai, and I had my first chance to see the communists in action. In the village square, about 200 obviously excited people were gathered. In front of the crowd, 5 communist cadres sat at 2 tables. We professors were seated a short distance behind them. The landlord, a haggard man of 40 with his hands tied behind him, was brought forward by 2 policemen who forced him to his knees. The villagers were encouraged to scream abuse at him. They slapped him, pulled his hair, pounded on his back with their fists, and spat on him. I noticed one man who needed no encouragement. He seemed consumed with hatred for the landlord, and I felt he must have suffered terribly. The struggle went on for hours until dusk. The prisoner did not once raise his head. I was astonished to learn that the man who had showed such animosity toward the landlord was the landlord's elder brother. Originally, the father of the 2 sons had divided his land between the 2 brothers. The older son had drunk and gambled away his inheritance. He then became almost a beggar, living off the grudging charity of his younger brother. The wastrel resented his brother's success, and he became the hero of the local land reform movement. Escape from Red China, page 54-6. In December 1950, 4 months before the night of the arrests, the Security Bureau had requested all those who had held positions with the Nationalist Party to register. The stated purpose was to give those who had made quote-unquote political mistakes a chance, quote, to start life anew, close quote. They were to submit autobiographies emphasizing their past nationalist activities. They also had to write, quote, social relationships reports, close quote, in which they listed the known details of every acquaintance, whether a friend, relative, or an associate. Guarantees were made repeatedly that no matter what one's quote-unquote evil doing had been or what position one had held with the nationalists, everyone who, quote, confessed everything to the people, close quote, would be treated leniently. Only those who failed to register would be punished. Escape from Red China, page 67. The number of people arrested throughout the country on the night of April 28, 1951 is not known. Nevertheless, almost everyone had some relative or acquaintance who simply disappeared. In Shanghai, many public buildings, including 2 schools, all of which had been taken over by the police weeks before, were used as prisons. One of the execution grounds was near the university. Every day we would see truckloads of prisoners. While we were in our classes, we would hear the terrible shooting. The trucks carrying away the corpses dripped streams of blood into the road that ran past the university buildings. Within the next few months, all the ex-nationalists were wiped out. Escape from Red China, page 66. Bob Lowe said nothing to his class and did not rally the students to try to stop the killing. They just waited their turn, and their turn would come. A few of the former nationalists were brought to trial. Handcuffed prisoners were brought out and made to kneel before the quote-unquote masses. Communist officials opened the trial with a speech denouncing the accused and listing his crimes. Previously arranged accusers then came forward to tell vividly and often sincerely their grievances. The crowd, harangued by the activists, were worked up to frenzied screaming, "Kill the counter-revolutionaries! Kill, kill, kill!" Thereupon the officials, quote, in response to the will of the masses, close quote, ordered the prisoners to be killed. Usually the sentence was carried out at once in front of the crowd. Escape from Red China, page 68. The universities were purged, and the professors were sent away to write thousands of pages of, quote, self-criticism and abject apology, close quote, and in their absence the students were read translations of lectures from Russia, and from then on the universities taught only politics. Bob Lowe left the university to run a flour mill because he thought it would be safer. And some of the professors tried to stay at the university, but the communists would park a loudspeaker truck in front of their houses to harass them all night, and then pressure the students to harass them all day. And many of these professors had given up good careers in America to come back to China to help the communists, and this was their reward. Things went from bad to worse, and all the managers of flour mills became the enemy and the target of struggles. And when so many of the mill managers started committing suicide, the government would back off a little, but very little work was being done because everybody was too busy being politically correct. And then the communists would start up a new scare campaign to get the people to be more productive. First, they took away all the farming tools from people who knew how to use them and gave them to poor Chinese peasants. Then they, quote-unquote, socialized China without the help of any machinery. And when food in China became scarce, the only thing the Chinese people could offer was passive resistance by staying out sick a lot or moving very slowly on the job, which only made things worse. And the situation went from very bad to even worse, and all the suffering only made the government crack down harder, and they expected the people themselves to do most of the cracking. Thus, although the individual belonged to a group, his greatest danger came from the group, from the only people who normally would be expected to understand, help, and protect him. The result was that he knew the terror of being utterly alone and vulnerable in a hostile society. The meetings therefore were a fearful strain. At the same time, they were stultifyingly dull, and the idea of the number of them you would have to attend down through the years made the future difficult to face. Escape from Red China, page 122. At 11:05 p.m. on the 7th of July in 1954, Bob Lowe decided it was time to escape from Red China, and Bob Lowe came up with a plan to make the communists trust him so he could manage his escape. When the communists would send less wheat to be ground, or change the prices, or make them pay fines and not let them lay off any workers, Bob Lowe would take all the blame for the problem so the communists would learn to trust him, and it seemed to work, because Bob Lowe was elected to the Shanghai People's Congress and was required to go to the Communist Party parties. I was astonished at the extravagance of these parties and at how thoroughly the normally fearsome party leaders abandoned themselves to wild merriment when they relaxed. Only the most attractive actresses, the most expensive food, and the finest imported liquor were served to them. The parties often lasted until dawn, and usually by the end most of the dignitaries were so drunk they had to be carried to their cars by their guards. Escape from Red China, page 145. Despite their antagonism to the bourgeoisie, the communists, including Mao Zedong and the other top leaders, were known to have a weakness for bourgeois girls. Escape from Red China, page 119. Bob Lowe was given the job of hosting foreign visitors and was responsible for convincing them that the communists in China were wonderful and that everything was going smoothly. Even Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru of India and President Sukarno of Indonesia were apparently impressed by the stage productions they were shown. Escape from Red China, page 159 and 60. The communists would take visitors to a controlled place where, quote, people lived in the village like animals in a zoo, under the constant scrutiny of visitors and officials. They had to be always clean and neat and dressed in their best clothes. They had to put on that peculiar act, a mixture of prudery, industriousness, and childlike simplicity, which the communists expect from the working class, close quote. Escape from Red China, page 163. Bob Lowe described that the peasants were angry that Russia got the nice white wheat while they only got the brown stuff. In my mills, the workers were especially bitter because none of them were allowed to buy the white flour we milled. Almost all of it went to Russia. Escape from Red China, page 148. A Russian was sent to inspect the mill and found bugs in the flour, and the Russian made them clean the factory thoroughly, and then came back and found another bug. An experienced old technician grabbed the offending insect, put it in his mouth, and ate it. "Let me see if I die from eating this one insect," he shouted. Escape from Red China, Ibid. The excitement had begun on June 28, 1956, when workers in Poznan, Poland, revolted against the communist rulers. The uprising was crushed, with 44 officially listed as killed, hundreds more wounded, and 1,000 people arrested. The importance of this event was in the fact that it belied one of the basic tenets of communist theory. If workers were the rulers in a socialist society, against whom could they revolt? Escape from Red China, page 228.